Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Lunch and Learn today. We have with us Dwight Taylor, who's going to talk about data reshaping with Tableau. Please do not forget to fill out the Lunch and Learn survey at the end of today's call. If not, I'll send out a friendly reminder later. With that said, I'll turn it over to Dwight. Thanks, Dwight.
Thanks a lot, Tawana. Appreciate everyone joining. Listen, thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to attend the Lunch and Learn. Hopefully today we'll share a couple of tips that will benefit you in your use of Tableau. Today's Lunch and Learn is really about a couple of, I would say, rarely used or frequently overlooked capabilities in Tableau when it comes to reshaping or shaping your data. And what we're going to do is take a look at a very bad Excel spreadsheet that we want to use eventually in Tableau and figure out some of the built-in tools that will help accelerate managing that data or shaping that data so that it can be used in Tableau. Okay? So for today's agenda, we're going to have 4 simple topics. We're going to talk about the data interpreter. We're going to talk about pivoting your data inside of Tableau. We're going to talk about splitting a combined field. Sometimes you'll get data where a field is sort of, they use or concatenate the values of a field with 2 different pieces of data, and you want to separate those out. And then we'll talk about calculated fields inside of the data connection window. And the truth, what I'm hoping to accomplish is that, shaping your data is easier than you thought inside of Tableau. Okay? So data. Here's a spreadsheet. It's an awesome spreadsheet, and it has some sales data. And I want to spend a little bit of time sort of talking about this spreadsheet because, in our experience in Tableau, can you hold on for 1 second? So I developed this spreadsheet for the sake of this example, and with respect to Excel, I don't know how many of you have seen Excel, but suffice it to say, Excel is the #1 source of data used. This is the #1 source of data used inside of Tableau. Users get Excel spreadsheets or they request data sources from people. And hold on for 1 second. Yeah, so it's the #1 data source used in Tableau by far. Users have Excel data spreadsheets that they receive from data management team members or what have you. And then they want to bring that data into Tableau for use. And this is one of the examples. I'll give another example of Excel spreadsheets that normally end up being shaped this way. If you ever download public data from a government website, they love stretching data across columns for the time period, right? Time series across columns. Anytime you download, from the EA or any type of other data source, census data, you'll find data like this. The challenge is, how do we use this in Tableau? So what we're going to walk through in our example today is we're going to take this specific data set and we'll see, what Tableau does with it. What we want to do is, maybe a couple of time series line charts to see how sales are doing, maybe a map, and do some comparisons. That's what we'd like to eventually create, some visualizations. And this is our data source. Any questions about the data source? I'll go through explaining a little bit of it. So maybe across 6 or 7 columns here, I have a set of merged cells. I have a bit of instruction here. I have a couple of dimensions, region and state. I have a time series, right, so month and year, and then I have some sales figures. And then I have a totals row that sort of sums up, the various sales figures for each month. Okay, pretty simple, not too complex. But what we're hoping to accomplish today is share with you the tools in Tableau that even if you have an extremely complex Excel spreadsheet, and by complex I mean, it has VBA, it has automation, it has subtables, it has hidden tables, it has all kind of the stuff that's possible to do inside of Excel. Tableau can help with that, okay, and we're going to demonstrate that for you. All right, so let's go to an open worksheet. I'll get out of presentation mode, and let's start by just connecting to our data. And some of you may have experienced it. Here's my spreadsheet, great name, and what I'm going to do is just connect to it. I'm going to tell Tableau this is what I want to connect to, and so do that. All right, you can see it brings in sheet 1, and there we go. Tableau's looking at my data, and we can see, here's my title, here's my instruction, and here's my totals row. All right, so we're just going to, do it like, we don't know that, there's a challenge here. The first challenge is that when you have a sort of a spreadsheet that is not data focused and has commentary or formatting or labels or titles and things like that in it, by default, Tableau does its best to try to bring in every cell that it believes is populated with some information. And even cells, it tries to weed out the cells that don't have information, but it'll bring them in. And so if I go back to the data source, I want you to notice a couple things. So the first thing is, let's look at F1. F1 in our spreadsheet is column A, right? And it has an instruction in column A for the second row, but the rest of the rows are null, right? And then row 2, which is the second row in our spreadsheet, has data or some content in the first cell, but the rest of the cells are null. And for our title, in actual column B, and then the rest of the columns are null, right? So we've got a couple of situations here, a couple of nulls and things like that. If we just bring that into Tableau, we can still begin to visualize things. Now, the F9, F1 through 15 is the way Tableau sort of gives a label to columns that it doesn't know it doesn't know how to determine the header by default. And the reason it doesn't know how to determine the header, and I'll go back to we'll open up our spreadsheet so that we can reference that. The reason it doesn't know how to interpret the header is because by default, Tableau likes to assume that the header is going to be the first row in the data source. Well, in our spreadsheet, it's not. Can we ask if you don't have a question that you put your phone on mute, please? Someone's not on mute. We can hear
I just
muted him. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks, Tawana. So we don't have any column headers here, right? So Tableau, in an effort to sort of bring some, sanity to this data source that we've just brought in, gives a systematic way of labeling at least the columns, right? So if we go to, let's see if we look at column 2. So column 2 has a null, and it has some regions, and it has some totals. It's sort of a mixed bag here. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually rename this to region, right? That's our region. And then if we wanted to, we could actually just weed out these things that we know is not region, right? We could just exclude those. And then we have what sort of looks like a region dimension, right? Let's see. I think the next field, that's F2, so F3 is state. And so if we do state, state is looking pretty good, right? So let's rename F3 to actually name that to state. Now, the second thing I want you to notice is that when Tableau can't, has a finds difficulty processing the data that you're bringing in, it also has a difficulty determining what type of content you're bringing in. So state is the name of a state, right? So ideally in Tableau, this would be a geographical. It would play a geographical role as a dimension in our data. So I think what we can do is let's go back, we can go to state and assign it a geographical role. And then because we thought about creating a map, let's see if we can get that. Yeah, so now we have a map of our states, which is good. That's good. And I'm just going to take number of records and put that on color so we can clearly see, what type of states we have. And since they're all equal, we all have 2 rows of data for each state, that's appropriate. But one of the things that we didn't know is that, number one, Tableau couldn't determine the name of a column, the name of our dimension, and it did not assign it an appropriate role for the type of content that's in the dimension. And now, since we have region, we can sort of use but we got a couple things going on here. So in my first worksheet, I filtered out the bad region values. In my second worksheet, I didn't remember to do that. So when I split my charts, when I split my geographical map by region, I'm getting some nulls, right? And so that's another complexity. And in addition, I have 4 unknowns down here. So one thing we can do now, what I'm demonstrating here is not what this session is about, but I'm demonstrating how, if you don't know about some of the tools I'm about to show you, this is some of the ways people wrangle their data. So I'm going to take this filter and I'm going to apply it to all using data source and then take a look back at our map. Okay, so that was somewhat successful at weeding out the bad values, but we still got region in here. Now, region is actually the label for region. It shouldn't be part of the data source, right? So in our filter, we need to actually exclude region as well. All right. And so, we've had to do some, I would say, we've had to do some hoop jumping to actually use this data that we got in Excel. But Tableau has a method and some tools that will better help you take spreadsheets that are sort of crappy or what have you and make use of them in Tableau. All right, so let's dig into our actual example. We'll create a brand new worksheet. I'm going to do a brand new data source, and we'll pull our same spreadsheet in. And this time we're going to use something called the data interpreter. See, it's right here. Now, by default, most people really don't pay attention to that because when they attach the data, their eyes are drawn to here because, they want to see their data and the columns and all that kind of good stuff. So, and this is sort of muted in a way, intentionally so. Tableau is a tool that for most of its functionality, it sort of falls into the background, at least from the main viewing area, which in this particular screen is the data source area or the data connection area. But there's a little tool here that's really nifty, okay, and it's called the data interpreter. Now, before I click this and show you what this does, let me remind you of what type of spreadsheet we have here, right? We've got some merged cells. We got data in a column and nothing else. Data in a row here in column A on row 4, but nothing else in that column. And then we've got, our month and year stretched across individual columns. And then we have a totals row, right? So let's see what the data interpreter does. And before I click it, let's notice what Tableau is actually discerning from our workbook. Our workbook has one tab. Tableau says, okay, you've got one table in your workbook, and that's what that icon means, a table, right? And if we look at the data, we can see how Tableau's bringing it in, right? Okay, great. So now let's turn on the data interpreter and see what Tableau does. Now, all I did was click the checkbox. Now, this is an error because something's wrong with Excel on my machine, but we can see that I don't have any data. I got an error, and I still have sheet 1 here. But there's something else that got created. I don't know if you noticed, but there is something known as a Tableau subtable here that it pulled out of sheet 1 and created. So let's go back. If I go back, before I click the data interpreter, I had sheet 1 and new union and then the data interpreter. Once I click the data interpreter or turn on the data interpreter, a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, Tableau creates a brand new table that's available for me to use as a data source, and it includes review the results, which if I click it, hopefully Excel cooperates. I've been having some problems with Excel on this computer. Yeah, so when I click it, Tableau opens up a spreadsheet for me, and the spreadsheet has a number of tabs in it. So the first tab is a tab that sort of explains things. Key for understanding the data interpreter results. Use the key to understand how your data source has been interpreted. To view the results, click a worksheet tab. Note, Tableau never makes changes to your underlying data source. So the original crappy spreadsheet is still there, unchanged. And then you have some keys here, which I won't read all of that. Has some links, and then it has a support request. If you're at the point where your spreadsheet is just winning, right? You're pinned on the mat and the count is 3. You can actually go to the support site. And then there's an article here, resolving common issues with the data interpreter. But let's take a look at some of the sheets. So what Tableau is doing here is, number one, this area is red, right? It's light red. So let's take a look back at the legend and see what light red means. Data is interpreted as column headers, field names. That's what red means. So here, and then what does green mean? Green means data is interpreted as values in your data source. So what Tableau is doing is separating the headers from the data, right? So this row 5 is a header. It's interpreting row 4 as a header, row 3 as a header, row 2 as a header, and row 1 as a header. Now, I don't know that that's what we want. In addition, it's also interpreting the totals row as a data row. Well, let's take a look back at what the totals row is data derived from an Excel merged cell is interpreted as value in your data source. So in essence, from our original spreadsheet, we had totals merged across columns B and C. But what the interpreter did when it assessed the data is split the word or duplicated the word totals in column B and again in column C. Okay? And then we can see the type here, right? These are data types. Or this is the type that Tableau is giving to the content in the cells across this row. All right, note, to search for all excluded data, use Control F on Windows or Command F on Mac, and then type data removed. So now, here's sheet 1 subtables. Aha. So remember what I said in Tableau is after we click the data interpreter, Tableau created what's known as a subtable. Created a subtable. In the data interpreter window, we can see that here's sheet 1 subtables. So in essence, what this would do if you had a more complex Excel spreadsheet is it would take each tab and describe what Tableau thinks is the appropriate data, right? The appropriate range of cells for the actual data from this badly formatted spreadsheet for Tableau consumption. When I say badly formatted, that's what I'm referring to, right? So now what Tableau is saying is, okay, the border around this area is the area that Tableau is going to use for our subtable. And then there's a separate tab that sort of shows you the subtable. And if we reference our key again, we can see that Tableau is considering these cells, the header cells, and all of this, the data, right? Now, I would say it's not exactly what we want, but it's really close, right? The data interpreter is not a magic bullet for every Excel problem you have, but it will get you a lot closer than just bringing in an Excel document that's badly formatted. So let's take a look at what Tableau is going to do with this now. Okay, now we're looking a lot better than we looked before. You remember before what we had is a bunch of columns, F1, F2, all the way through F15, no names or anything like that. Now we've got region, we've got state. Oh, and look at the data role for state. Tableau actually recognizes it as a geographical field. It did not actually end up duplicating totals for this particular version of the subtable, but it did weed out, going back to our original spreadsheet, so it, dropped these rows because they're not consequential to the data source, and everything below it is also ignored, right? So it just took this total region and then made it into a data source. So the question is, let's use this data source now. We'll call this phase 2 of data shaping. All right, now in phase 2 of data shaping, we're starting out pretty good, right? We've got state that we can double click and automatically get a map. But if we want to actually see sales per state, let's do April. I'm going to put that on color. Right, so sales per state, and let's see, at 5. So all of the states have to, but what if we want to see, so we have April, now let's put in August. And now, so what we're doing right now is we're switching between months. Now there's a way to actually get around this. We can actually do this and actually include all of our months. And now we can see that there's a, there's a sum that's being used here. So not a sum, but we can see all of our months across the state, but they're actually sitting on top of one another. You can't really see that, but they are. The values are actually sitting on top of one another. So California says 51, but that's for September 2015, because September 2015 is the bottom pill. And so if I switch this like this, let's put September up here. Oh, it's sorting them in alphabetical order. So the alphabet that is closest to Z is the one that sits on top, and you can't see any of the other ones. So that's not necessarily what we would want in a geographical map if we're trying to, look at our sales across the geography of our sales regions. So what option do we have? Well, so we talked about the data interpreter, and I don't know if there are any questions about the data interpreter, but if you have questions, feel free to just jump in and ask. The data interpreter does its best to take an Excel spreadsheet that's not really ideal for use in Tableau and tries to make sense out of it. And I will tell you that it's pretty good, but it's not 100% correct all the time, right? And so one of the things that we know is that we have a row in our data source that's really not appropriate, right? And so if we take a look at region, totals is not actually a region, right? So if we take totals and exclude that, in addition, because totals is a sum of all of the regions together, if we include totals in our results, we're actually artificially inflating our results. So we're going to end up reporting wrong data. So with this format, we can exclude totals, and then we get a more accurate format of our sales, right? But still, we're having to use the measure values and stack values on top of one another, and then doesn't make it easy for us to see, the total sales across all months. In addition, looking at it would be very difficult with the data shaped this way to actually get a line chart across time. To create a line chart. So were there any questions before I move on to pivoting in Tableau? Okay, great. There's still somebody who's not on. mute. So I'm going to create a new worksheet. We're going to add our data source back in from scratch. And this time, we're definitely going to use the data interpreter. We're going to use our subtable because we like that. But this time, we're going to do something a little bit different. The first thing we're going to do, now I'm using a live connection to my data source. I don't even want the totals row in my data source at all, okay? So I'm going to just use a filter. I'm going to filter my region, and I'm going to exclude totals, okay? I don't want this in the data source at all. And this is what's known as a data source filter. So the filter is being done before the data is actually brought into Tableau, okay? Now that looks nice from our original data source, right? Now, the challenge that we have is we have these months and years stretched across time, okay? And so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to use in Tableau something that's known as a pivot feature. Basically what I'm doing is I'm left-clicking January 2016. I'm going to go to the, let's say I only wanted to pivot the first quarter, right? I'm going to hold down the Shift key and then do another left-click on the last column that I want to select in sequence. If I hold down the Control key, I can click individual columns, okay? I'm actually going to do all 12 months. So I'm clicking January 2016, hold down the Shift key, then left-click December 2016. And now I have a range of cells. That's my time series. It's the total time that I have in my spreadsheet. And usually when you get spreadsheets like this, you may find a 24-month one, but usually it's 12 months, right? And so let's right-click, and lo and behold, we have a feature here called Pivot. So let's try this feature. I'm going to pivot this data and then see what Tableau does. Oh, wow. So Tableau has taken our data, which, you know, had region and state as columns, and had each month and year as a column, and changed it into a column that contains date now. So, you know, this is pivot field name and then pivot field value. This is the default title that Tableau gives it, but we can rename this, right? We can rename this to date, and we can rename this to sales, right? So now we have data, and by the way, in terms of the shape of your data that is most ideal for Tableau, I'll give you a tip. It's atomic level data, right? It's row level data, so that each dimension is in a column of its own, and then you have one or more measure columns, right? And so what we have here is date, region, sales, and that looks pretty nice. In addition to this, when it's time for data shaping, I don't know how many notice these two buttons right here, but this button shows us a view of our columns and our data, but you can also look at the metadata view inside of Tableau. And so if you click this little button here, it takes you to a metadata view, right? And what's interesting is that it tells us the source of these fields, right? So this came from our subtable that our data interpreter derived, and these are a result of us pivoting inside of Tableau. So we know how each field got, created. And then it gives you the original names of the fields. Okay? All right, so now we have our data in a nice little shape. And let's go to sheet 4 and see how easy it is to create that diagram we were trying to do before. So we double-clicked on state, and what we wanted is we wanted total sales there. Now, you'll notice the colors are similar to our previous chart, right? But the values are not the same. So let's kind of do a comparison, right? if I hover over California, my value for September 2016 is, we were in the red 51 bucks, right? But if I look at California from my new chart, from my shaped data, we're actually in the red $267. So we pretty much need to chuck California as a sales region or fire the sales guy out there, right? But my point in this is, when you have a data source that has data shaped in a way that's not ideal for Tableau, you may end up actually displaying misleading results, okay? So data shaping is important in terms of integrity of your visualization and also your analysis phase, right? So that was really simple. Now, for the last example, what we're going to do is talk about the last two features of Tableau, which is the split feature and calculated fields inside of the data source window. Right? So let's add our data source again for the fourth time. We're going to use our data interpreter. We're not going to use sheet 1. We're going to use our derived table, and we're going to do our pivot because we really enjoyed that. Who doesn't love a good pivot? We're going to rename this to date, rename this to sales, and then we have a field here that is called date, but if you'll notice in our sheet, it's not actually a date column. It's a text field. So let's see if we can actually change it to a date. What does Tableau do if we change that to a date? Okay, so now let's take our date and pull up. Oh, look at it. It looks like a data type, right? It has the default behavior of a date type in Tableau, but it's null. And to verify that, we'll just take this and drop date out here, right? What we're used to seeing when we do that is the number of years that your data encompasses, spread across the axis there, right? So obviously our date column, which we renamed after we did the pivot, is not in a format that Tableau recognizes as a date. And so what we're going to do is in our fourth data source, if I can figure out which one is the fourth one, we'll go back into that data source. And we're going to use something that's known, well, first I'm going to show you how to split fields. So let's say, this date included, I don't know, something like zip code. So imagine that the first three letters are, the date, and the last four letters are, I don't know, zip code, the 4 digits that come after the zip code. Tableau has something known as split. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the split option by default, and let's see what Tableau does. So when I choose the split option from our original date column, which has a space in between the first three letters of the month and the last 4 digits of the year, Tableau created a brand new column with just the first part of that. So it split it based along the space value. So it took the space and then it took what was ever to the left of the space and created a new column from that. But that's not really helpful because we can't convert this to a date either, right? If we convert it to a date, we can see here that all our values are null. Same thing we saw in the worksheet. All right, so let's get rid of that. That's not helpful. There is a capability of doing a custom split. So we can actually, now in this, so when you do a split for the custom split, the first thing you want to do is specify the delimiter. So, let's say you have zip code dash and then the last 4 digits of the zip code. In that case, your separator would be a dash. It looks like there are values in here, but they're actually gray. And they're there to indicate some common separators that you might want to use, right? So there's a dash, a comma, semicolon, colon, and ellipse that sometimes are used as, to concatenate different field values or different dimensions together. Okay, so in our case, we're actually not using a dash. We're actually using a space. So if I hit the space bar, all the values disappear. We can see that if I move my cursor using arrows, we have a blank space there. And then it's saying, what do you want to split off? Right? So if we have a column that, has a dash or a space, the first means split whatever is to the left of the delimiting character or the separator. Last means split whatever to the right of the separator. And then the number of columns is how many columns do you actually want to separate this information into, right? Now, because we're splitting by a space and we only have two things, one on the left and one on the right of the space, if we choose last, no matter what the number of columns is, you'll see what Tableau does, right? It creates a bunch of columns that are blank, and then it splits our two values out into columns, right? So, I mean, you can create that. You can up the number of columns you want to create all you want, but the only thing that's going to happen is Tableau's going to just create some blank fields for you, okay? All right, so let's go back. We'll do our custom split, and this time we're going to do space, and we'll do all. And you'll notice when you choose all that the columns becomes disabled. Then Tableau splits our column into two separate columns. Now, because our objective is to actually convert date into a date field, this still is not going to help us. But let's try anyway, right? We'll try to convert APR to a date. Is Tableau smart enough to just choose a month and choose a year? No, obviously. What about year, right? Is Tableau smart enough to choose a month and a day? No. So neither one of those values being split apart or together is sufficient for us to convert, after we pivoted our data, to convert it to an actual date value so we can use it in Tableau to create time series. So let's go back and get rid of both of those because they're not helpful, which brings us to one of the last things I want to show you in terms of data shaping. You can actually create calculated fields right here inside of the data connection window. I don't know if you all knew that or not, but you can. I want to do something, filter out totals as my region, which is consistent with what I did before. Great. And what we want to do is actually create a calculated field for April 2016, okay? And what we're going to do is I'm going to create a calculated field with this, and I'm going to use a function in Tableau. Now, the scope of this Lunch and Learn is not to go over what's possible using Tableau functions, but I'm going to use one here because I want to demonstrate, when you're shaping your data, what type of tools are available to you. Calculated fields are one of them. I'm going to use a function which is a subset of one of the functions that are specific to strings. Since we know we have ABC here, data is a string, I'm going to use a function that is particular to a string, and it's called replace. Now, the replace function takes three values. It takes the original field, right, which we know is our date. It's a string value. The second argument is what string do you want to replace in the field? And in our example, what we have is a 3-character month acronym, a blank space, and then a 4-digit year. So what we want to do is we want to replace the blank space, and then the third argument is, okay, you want to replace all the blank spaces, and what do you want to replace it with? And so what we want to replace it with is a blank space, a comma, and a blank space. And I'll show you why I'm doing that in a second, okay? But so what I'm doing is in this column here that has a 3-character month, space, 4-character year, I'm going to replace the blank space with a blank space, then a comma, then an additional blank space. All right, So let's do that. There we go. Actually, I want to edit that. I actually wanted a 1, a space, the number 1, comma, and then a blank space. There we go. So now what we have is we have a text column. I used a calculation, and we'll call this derived date. And, you know, some of you may say, well, Dwight, you know, why are you choosing the first day of the month? The data didn't tell us what day of the month the data was captured. For the purposes of that we want to use this day column for, I don't think the day matters because we're not going to be creating visualizations that are by day, right? So for every month represented in our data, we just need a day. You could have chose the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, doesn't matter what day, because we're going to be looking at data at a monthly level because that's the grain with which we got our crappy spreadsheet, right? It's on a monthly basis. And since the data does not include information about which day of the month the data was captured, we can, you know, any assumption is fair in the absence of actual evidence, okay? All right, so I chose the first of the month, and now what we're going to do is see if we can convert, does Tableau, now this is still a text column, right? But is Tableau capable of recognizing this as an actual date and converting into a date so that we can use it in our data? Well, let's see. Oh, look at that. So there are no nulls here. If we scroll down, we can validate that, right? With a simple calculation in our data connection window, we're able to weed out the totals row, which we don't want in Tableau. We'll allow Tableau to create totals if we actually want to see that in our visualization. We were able to pivot our columns because of the shape of our data. Well, first we were able to actually interpret this data to just grab the most relevant data from this sort of badly designed spreadsheet. When I say badly designed, I mean in terms of use for Tableau, where you get the biggest bang for your buck inside of Tableau. And then we were able to pivot our data. Then we were able to split this in case we needed to split data. So we learned about split. And since that didn't necessarily serve our needs in order to create time series charts with this data, we were actually able to create a calculation inside of the data connection window so that by the time we get to a worksheet inside of Tableau, now we've got the fields that we want, right? So I'm going to double-click State, I'm going to choose Sales, I'm going to drop it on Color, and then I'm going to create a new chart because that's a wonderful chart, but I actually want to look at my date across a time series, and I'm going to double-click Sales, and we're going to make it a line chart, and instead of looking at years, since we only have 1 year, we're going to expand it to quarter. Let's put Sales up here. That's our line chart, and we'll expand quarter to month. And since these are all discrete, we can actually change that to continuous month. There's our line chart, right? And we'll turn on some values so we can see how we're doing over time. And with that, we simply create our dashboard. And it's a lot better than it was. Let's do this. Put our map on top. Maps are nice. And we'll put our line chart on the bottom. And we don't need that out there. All right, so now we have a dashboard that's a little bit more reasonable in terms of this bad data that we started with. Okay, so quick review. What we've covered in today's Lunch and Learn is that when you get an Excel spreadsheet that you want to use inside of Tableau, you don't necessarily need to manually copy and paste cells and get to reformatting cells and things of that nature. There are actually tools right inside of Tableau that allows you to do some very nifty things and very creative things, especially when it's with Excel spreadsheets or any data source that's sort of shaped, in a way that's sort of weird for Tableau to handle. you can do those things right inside of Tableau and come up with a pretty nice result. Okay. Any questions?
Hey, Dwight, this is Rob. I got a question for you. Tying this back to last week's sessions on performance, do you notice any performance hit for doing any of these, or any of them more performance, I don't know, of a hit, or what do you think?
That's a great question. I'm going to give you a tip, and because you asked that question, I'm going to put the tip in the agenda so it's included in this Lunch and Learn so that everybody can sort of get the tip. The answer to your question is there is one type of calculation that you can do that is really bad, and that type of calculation is a calculation on text fields. Everything that you've seen me do is not a performance killer. It won't hinder performance at all, okay? So you don't have to be
Very
concerned.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. See that one there? And I want to change the color of that because it's kind of different. So, you know, to give the impression that that's part of everything. So we'll just do it like that. All right. So, tip for everyone that's on the Lunch and Learn. Tableau is an analytic tool, which means that it thrives on creating analytic calculations, right? Measures. So additive and non-additive counting, it does well at. Calculations on text fields or text values, especially calculations that operate or act on every row of data, will really slow down your Tableau data. Now, let's go back to, I want to really address Rob's question, because one of the data sources we actually created a calculated field. That's exactly what we did, right? We did a replace, and this calculation right here will act on every row of data, right? And so how do we get around this? If we know we need to do this with the data that we're using, how do we get around the performance hit? The answer to the question is you can still do this, but you do this in the data connection window, and then you take an extract. Okay? If you need to, ideally, if you need to do a text calculation, the number one choice should be, okay, let's do it at the database, long before the data comes into Tableau. But if you have an Excel spreadsheet, it's sort of after the fact, right? And so if you have a very large, Excel spreadsheets can't really get that large, but they can get pretty large. Or even if you have a CSV file and you need to do a text calculation, you can do it, but in order to not cause a negative impact on the performance of the operation of your dashboard as a result of that text calculation, what you might want to do is create an extract, right? And what I'm going to do is remove our filter. I want to tell you why I'm removing this filter. So when we were using a live connection, I added data source filter here because there's no way to add a filter to an extract when you're not taking an extract, right? But if you're doing an extract, you don't want to use the filter here because we don't want to bring this data into Tableau, right? We want to filter our data right here. And so for totals, for a region, we want to exclude that totals value and then create our extract. If you do it this way, Rob, create an extract. Number one, create your calculated field in the data connection window itself. Number two, do an extract. Once you get into your sheet, your Tableau dashboard and the performance, more importantly, of those dashboards and anything you create in Tableau will not be impacted by that text calculation. Great question. That was a really good question, actually.
Dwight, could you just touch on the differentiation between the two filters for the extract and for the live feed that you just did?
So let's go back. So I have an extract here. When you enable an extract, you can actually add filters to the extract operation, right? So what this means is no matter what my data source is, it doesn't matter whether it's SQL Server, Excel, CSV, Oracle, it doesn't matter what it is. If I add a filter here, what this tells Tableau is, okay, the original data source has 5 regions. It has east, west, north, and south, and totals, the word totals, but don't bring that stuff into Tableau. We don't want to see it, period. That's what this says. This particular filter window you can't get to, and it does other stuff, right, like aggregations for visible dimensions and allows you to specify if you're doing an extract. By the way, and this is a side topic from today's data shaping, but I guess it falls under data shaping. When you want to create an extract and you want to do incremental loads of that extract, meaning, you know, let's say you have a sales extract and you only want to, every day you want your extract to refresh on the Tableau server, but you only want to pull the previous day's data. In other words, the difference between the data you already have and the new data that was added. In order to create that type of extract, when you create the extract in the very beginning, you have to choose incremental here. You have to choose it. Now, it's grayed out for me because my original data source doesn't have a date column in it. My original data source only has text columns. And you can't use this derived field to filter the original data source. You have to use a date value that's in the original data source. That's why I can't choose incremental. But if you want to create an incremental extract that, you know, every day pulls in the difference or new data that's been added, you must do it when you create the extract. You can't do it afterwards. If you try to do it afterwards, you won't be able to create an incremental extract. But to answer your question, yes, the difference between these two is that this one is enabled. Both of them are enabled when you do an extract, and only one of them is enabled when you're doing a live connection, this one here. So what I did is, yeah, no problem. What I did is just move our filter from the live filter or the data source filter to the extract. And the official terms are these different filter types. This is a data source filter. This is an extract filter. Okay, a data extract filter. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. We have our data. Now it's an extract. Let's go back to our worksheet, and we can tell that the 2 cylinders with the arrow going from one to the other indicates an extract, and the rest of these are live data sources or live connections to our data source. Okay, all right, I think that wraps up today's topic for shaping your data. This workbook and the recording, of course, will be available to everyone. By all means, if you are using Excel spreadsheets and they come from Excel whizzes and people who create Excel workbooks that are complex, I invite you to use the data interpreter. It is pretty smart. That's what I'll tell you. Okay? Once again, the caveat is that it doesn't get everything 100% right, but it is pretty intuitive. Okay? And it'll give you a leg up when it comes to formatting data ideal for Tableau. And if you're having challenges creating some visualization, sometimes the shape of your data is the answer to the challenge. Okay? All righty. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Dwight.
Oh, wait.
Thank you, Dwight.
Reminder, there's a link there if you want to read about the data interpreter and some of the other cleanup tools that are inside of Tableau. We want to thank you. Don't forget to take the survey. It really helps. And have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dwight. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye.